Atheists are just the same as fundamentalist Christians, pushing their beliefs on others. Welcome to Friday Fallacy. This week we're looking at the false analogy fallacy. The false analogy fallacy is when a weak or erroneous analogy is used to argue for a point. That is, rather than establish a strong analogy, only a superficial or irrelevant similarity is present. This is not a sound way of arguing, as the fact that two things have similar properties does not guarantee they're similar in all relevant ways. That the USA and Canada both have capitalist economies in no way means that they take the same approach to welfare. That Germany and Australia both have socialised medicine in no way means that they both take the same approach to warfare. Some examples of the false analogy fallacy. Quantum mechanics and consciousness are both so mysterious they are probably related. Mousetraps and cells are both irreducibly complex, so they must both have been designed. Creation requires a creator. Christians follow the Bible, so they have to believe in talking snakes. Blaming guns for killing people is like blaming spoons for making you fat. Not all analogies are false analogies. The false analogy fallacy occurs when the analogy is weak, that is, based on a small sample or irrelevant characteristics. For example, it's not a false analogy to argue that two cars of similar size, engine, and technology are likely to have similar performance characteristics. It is a false analogy to argue that two cars made by the same company will certainly have the same performance. One thing to note is that any argument by analogy needs to be supported by establishing that the characteristics in common are relevant to the point being made. The less well supported this is, the more likely it's a false analogy. For example, simply asserting that because two people are Christians, they must have similar political beliefs is a false analogy. But if you can establish that they are both of the same denomination and that their particular denomination has a very particular political view, then this is not a false analogy. One way in which people make false analogies is to misuse labels. If a label or grouping is sufficiently broad, then two things both having the same label tells us very little about any other characteristics they may have. A common false analogy is arguing that guns aren't intrinsically harmful because they are just tools, like hammers, knives, or cars. In this case, the label tool is so broad that almost anything can fit in that category. And so to imply that there's necessarily any relevant similarity between two things that are tools is a false analogy. In conclusion, the false analogy fallacy is when a weak or erroneous analogy is used to argue for a point. Until next time, keep your fallacies to yourself.